In 1941, when the first American Jeeps appeared on training grounds and docks, almost no one believed they mattered. Not the press, not Allied officers, and certainly not Germany. Compared to tanks, bombers, and battleships, the Jeep looked almost embarrassing. Small wheels, thin metal, no armor, no heavy weapon. To many observers, it seemed like a toy accidentally shipped to a global war. German intelligence reports from the early years of the conflict barely mentioned it. When they did, it was dismissed as a simple utility vehicle, useful perhaps for officers or messengers, but irrelevant to combat. The Wehrmacht was focused on tanks like the Panzer IV, artillery barrages, and carefully planned logistics columns. A light, unarmored car did not fit their idea of what decided wars. Even some American officers were skeptical. The U.S. Army had asked manufacturers to design a fast, lightweight reconnaissance vehicle under extreme time pressure. The result was crude but functional. There was no comfort, no protection, and no elegance. It rattled, bounced, and looked unfinished. Few believed this machine would survive the realities of modern warfare. But war does not reward appearances. As American forces began deploying overseas, the Jeep quietly went with them, into North Africa, Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself. At first, it stayed in the background, hauling supplies, carrying officers, pulling radios, or moving wounded soldiers. It was everywhere, yet unnoticed. That invisibility became its greatest strength. German soldiers began seeing the same strange vehicle again and again. It appeared on muddy roads where trucks got stuck. It crossed broken bridges. It moved at night during shelling under conditions where heavier vehicles failed. Units would destroy American armor, only to find new troops arriving hours later, carried, supplied, and coordinated by Jeeps. Slowly, perception changed. Captured German diaries and post-war interviews reveal a growing realization. This small vehicle was not just transport. It was mobility itself. It allowed American units to react faster, reposition quicker, and stay supplied in ways the German army increasingly could not. The Jeep did not replace tanks or artillery, it made them usable. By the time German officers truly understood its importance, it was too late. The Jeep had already become part of every American formation, from airborne units to armored divisions. What had once looked laughable now symbolized something far more dangerous. An army that could move, adapt, and recover faster than its enemy. The machine no one took seriously had quietly changed the rhythm of the war, and Germany noticed only after it could no longer stop it. By 1943, German soldiers across multiple fronts began reporting something strange. American units were appearing where they should not have been, too fast, too organized, and too soon after setbacks. Roads thought impassable were suddenly active. Gaps assumed safe were filled overnight. The explanation was not tanks or aircraft. It was mobility, relentless, flexible, and constant. At the center of this shock was the Jeep. Unlike German or Soviet doctrine, which relied heavily on centralized transport and scheduled movement, the American Army decentralized mobility. Thousands of Jeeps were distributed down to platoon and company levels. Commanders no longer waited for trucks or orders from the rear. If something needed to move, men, ammunition, radios, wounded soldiers, it moved immediately. German officers were trained to expect pauses. After artillery barrages, after air attacks, after armored engagements. War, as they understood it, had a rhythm. The Americans broke that rhythm. A unit hit in the morning could reorganize and counterattack by afternoon. A destroyed supply column did not halt and advance. Another route, another Jeep, another improvised solution appeared. In North Africa, German reports described American columns bypassing roads entirely, cutting across desert terrain where wheeled vehicles were expected to fail. In Italy's mountains, Jeeps climbed paths meant for mules. In Normandy, they threaded through hedgerows, pulling guns, towing supplies, and guiding infantry through chaos. What shocked German commanders most was not speed alone. It was coordination. Jeeps carried radios forward, allowing artillery observers, infantry leaders, and tank commanders to communicate in real time. Decisions that once took hours now took minutes. Fire missions were called faster. Reinforcements arrived sooner. Retreats became organized instead of panicked. Captured German soldiers often remarked that Americans seemed to be everywhere at once. This was not exaggeration. It was the psychological effect of an army that could move continuously without waiting for perfect conditions. The Jeep turned mobility into a weapon, not dramatic, not loud, but decisive. Germany attempted to copy the concept, but lacked the industrial capacity and fuel to do so at scale. One Jeep did not matter. Tens of thousands did. Each one multiplied the effectiveness of every soldier it supported. By late 1944, the realization was clear. The Jeep was not just transportation. It was the bloodstream of the American army. Destroying tanks slowed advances. Destroying trucks delayed supplies. But as long as the Jeeps kept moving, the Americans never truly stopped. The shock was not that America had better weapons. The shock was that America could move everywhere all the time. The American Jeep was never designed to impress. It was designed to survive. From the very beginning, U.S. military planners understood one brutal truth of modern war. Machines break. Bullets hit engines. Mud destroys suspensions. Dust chokes carburetors. And when equipment fails far from factories, complexity becomes the enemy. The Jeep was built around this reality. Its design philosophy was brutally simple. No unnecessary armor. No fragile systems. Flat body panels that could be bent back into shape with a hammer. A basic four-cylinder engine that could run poorly and still run. Every part was chosen not for elegance, but for repairability under fire. American mechanics often joked that a Jeep could be fixed with a wrench, a screwdriver, and stubbornness. That joke wasn't far from the truth. Field manuals were short. Parts were standardized. A broken Jeep could be cannibalized to fix two others, and those two could still keep an entire unit moving. German forces noticed this immediately. Their own vehicles were often more advanced on paper, heavier, more powerful, more complex. But complexity came at a cost. Repairs required specialized tools, trained technicians, and replacement parts that were increasingly scarce as the war dragged on. The Jeep needed none of that. In North Africa, Jeeps ran for weeks in sandstorms that destroyed engines never designed for such abuse. In Italy, they bounced across rocky mountain roads that snapped axles on heavier vehicles. In Normandy, mud swallowed trucks, but Jeeps clawed their way out. Even when damaged, they kept going. There are countless accounts of Jeeps driving with bullet-pierced radiators, leaking oil, missing headlights, or bent frames. As long as the engine turned, the mission continued. When they finally stopped, repairs happened on the spot. Soldiers learned to fix their own vehicles because they had to, and because they could. German officers examining captured Jeeps were often unimpressed at first glance. Thin metal, no protection, exposed components. But after weeks of fighting Americans, they began to understand. This machine wasn't meant to survive hits. It was meant to survive war. One German report described the Jeep as primitive, but endlessly present. That presence was the result of design choices made far from the battlefield, choices that prioritized reliability over perfection. While German vehicles waited for parts that never arrived, American Jeeps were patched, restarted, and sent forward again. Logistics won battles not by brilliance, but by endurance. The Jeep didn't need to be strong. It needed to keep moving. And because it was built to survive and easy to fix, it did exactly that, long after more impressive machines had fallen silent. The American Jeep was not just a vehicle. To the men who fought with it, it became something far more important. On the battlefield, soldiers rarely saw the Jeep as machinery. They saw it as a solution. Whatever the problem was, the Jeep somehow fit into the answer. It carried officers to the front lines under fire. It hauled ammunition when trucks couldn't pass. It evacuated wounded men when stretchers were too slow. In moments of chaos, when plans collapsed and radios went silent, the Jeep kept moving, and so did the soldiers who depended on it. Infantry units quickly adapted it for everything imaginable. Machine guns were mounted on the hood. Radios were bolted into the back. Stretchers were strapped across the sides. In desperate moments, Jeeps towed artillery pieces that were never meant to move that fast. There was no official manual for half of this. Soldiers improvised, and the Jeep accepted it all. In Normandy, paratroopers used Jeeps dropped by glider to reconnect scattered units. In the Ardennes, Jeeps ran supplies through snowstorms that froze men where they stood. In the Pacific, Marines drove them through jungle mud that swallowed boots whole. The Jeep didn't complain. It just worked. For soldiers exhausted by fear, cold, and constant movement, the Jeep became something familiar, almost comforting. You could recognize its engine sound in the dark. You could trust it to start when everything else failed. Some units even gave their Jeeps names, painted slogans on them, or treated them like a member of the squad. German soldiers noticed this relationship immediately. Captured reports describe American troops as unusually mobile and confident. They appeared suddenly, struck hard, and disappeared just as fast. Often, the key difference wasn't firepower, it was transport. The Jeep allowed American units to react faster, regroup quicker, and exploit opportunities before the enemy could respond. German infantry, by contrast, relied heavily on foot movement and horses long into the war. When they encountered American units supported by Jeeps, the contrast was impossible to ignore. One German officer wrote that the Jeep seemed everywhere at once, carrying officers, weapons, wounded, and orders with equal ease. It blurred the line between front line and rear, between command and combat. For American soldiers, this meant something profound. The Jeep gave them independence. A squad didn't have to wait. Commander didn't need permission. If something needed doing, the Jeep made it possible. In war, that freedom saved time, and time saved lives. The Jeep wasn't the strongest weapon America fielded. It wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the most dangerous. But it was the one soldiers trusted the most. Because no matter the mission, fighting, fleeing, rescuing, or surviving, the Jeep was always there, not as a machine, but as a friend that never left them behind. In war, respect for the enemy is rare. Admiration is even rarer. Yet among German soldiers, officers, and engineers during World War II, one American machine earned exactly that, the Jeep. At first glance, it made no sense. The Jeep was unarmored, lightly built, and carried no heavy weapon by default. Compared to German half-tracks or armored cars, it looked almost civilian. Some German troops reportedly laughed when they first encountered one abandoned on the battlefield. That laughter didn't last long. As the war dragged on, German units began to notice a pattern. Wherever American forces appeared, the Jeep appeared with them, sometimes before them. It moved officers rapidly between units, brought supplies forward without delay, and evacuated wounded men before artillery could find them. German after-action reports increasingly mentioned American mobility as a key advantage. The Jeep, they concluded, was the invisible link holding that mobility together. Captured German documents and memoirs reveal a grudging respect. One Wehrmacht officer described the Jeep as a perfectly adapted machine for modern war, noting that it allowed American troops to operate with a speed German units simply could not match. Unlike German vehicles, which were often specialized and complex, the Jeep was brutally simple. German mechanics who examined captured Jeeps were surprised by how easy they were to repair. Parts were interchangeable. Maintenance required minimal tools. Even badly damaged Jeeps could often be made operational again within hours. This simplicity was not accidental, and German engineers recognized that. Some went as far as recommending that Germany copy the design. Attempts were made, but wartime shortages, industrial strain, and bureaucratic resistance prevented any true equivalent from being produced in meaningful numbers. Meanwhile, German soldiers did what soldiers always do. They used what worked. Captured jeeps were prize trophies, not for prestige, but for survival. German units repainted them, replaced markings, and used them until they broke down, or until fuel ran out. In some areas, German officers preferred captured jeeps over their own vehicles. That preference spoke volumes. In letters home and post-war interviews, German veterans often mentioned the jeep when discussing American strengths. Not tanks, not bombers. The jeep, because it represented something deeper than hardware. It symbolized American thinking.
Fast decisions. Practical solution.
Mobility over tradition. Efficiency over perfection. The jeep was not intimidating on its own, but it enabled everything around it. It made American units flexible, unpredictable, and resilient. In modern war, those qualities mattered more than raw firepower. For German soldiers trained in rigid doctrine and struggling under logistical collapse, the jeep was a constant reminder of what they lacked. And in war, recognizing the enemy's advantage is the most honest form of respect. The jeep never fired the biggest gun. It never wore the thickest armor. But when even your enemy wants to use your equipment and wishes they had built it themselves, that is the ultimate compliment.